Welcome, everyone, to Governing Conversations. This is a co-creation of the Digital Interest Lab at NYU and the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. The Governing Conversations series aims to provide scholars across an interdisciplinary set of scholars, actually, across a wide range of fields and interests to reflect on the need to think about how we're governing today. We have had 3 different sections of this series, and cybersecurity is the current set of the series, and today is the second event in that series. Cybersecurity is co-sponsored with FGV, Center for Technology and Society, and BRICS Project, and we're lucky today to also have one of our sponsors on the panel, Professor Belli. And I'm going to leave you in the hands of our very capable moderator, Sophia Chang, who is a researcher with the BRICS Project on today's topic of BRICS and cybersecurity.
Thank you, Professor Washington, for that intro. And thank you, David, for helping and supporting us during the organization of this conversation. Welcome, everybody. So today's topics for the governing conversation will be BRICS and the cybersecurity, because this powerful bloc that has emerged in a very unusual way, it also has been developing a lot of policies and laws and regulations in the digital governance space. And it's very interesting to observe it not only as a bloc, but how it also influences the rest of countries and practices across the globe. Today here with us, we have Professor Luca Belli, who's a professor of Internet Governance and Regulation at FGV Law School, where he also directs the Center for Technology and Society and is my research coordinator at the BRICS Project. We also have Ksenia Imurshina. She's a cyber activist and researcher based in Paris. She's also a tenured researcher at the Center for Internet and Society and associated researcher at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. She's also a specialist in usability of privacy-enhancing technologies, and she's a part of Delta Chat and Kino browser teams. We have Rintraji Basu, who is a non-resident research fellow at the Center for Internet and Society in India, researching geopolitics and constitutionality of emerging technologies. He's also a lawyer. And finally, we also have Professor Sizwe Snail, who's a partner at the Snail Attorneys at Law and publishes several papers on cyber law and IT law and regularly commenting on various South African journals, newspapers, television, and radio talk shows. He's also a member of the BRICS Advisory Board and a visiting professor at the FGV Law School as well. Welcome, everybody. We are going to start our conversations now, and I thought we could follow the BRICS order to make it easier. So we're going to start with B, which is Brazil, and Professor Luca Belli will be presenting on cybersecurity governance in the BRICS, a little bit about convergence and divergence, and we'll focus on some of the most recent cybersec developments in the BRICS grouping. Professor Belli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Just to point out, it will be cybersec, not cybersec, because otherwise people might think that I will speak about some obscenity during the presentation. So cybersecurity indeed, and I prepared a very short PowerPoint presentation so that you can also have an understanding of what documents I will use as references for presentation, and if you want, you can download them. The majority of the documents I will use are available in open access on the BRICS website, cyberbricks.info, where you can find all publications, event recordings of events, studies that we have been developing over the past 4 years. And of course, cybersecurity is one of the main avenues of research of the BRICS project, which is hosted by CTS FGV. So Center for Technology and Society at FGV. As I was mentioning, all publications are in open access. Particularly, I will deal with cybersecurity aspects that are also illustrated in this book, BRICS Cybersecurity Regulations in the BRICS, that we published last year. And you can also find in a preprint open access version on the website. There are also a lot of other interesting tools comparing cybercrime regulation in the BRICS, cyber other areas of cybersecurity like data protection, data security, these kind of things, and I really encourage you to check them. And to start having a little bit of introduction about the BRICS, because I'm not sure that everyone listening to us is acquainted with this very unusual club. It was created around 15 years ago as a political entity. We can see it as a sort of G7 of the developing world. Indeed, it has been molded with a club governance system like the G7 or G8 in mind, but it includes these 5 very large emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which are very relevant not only for their economic might and geopolitical influence, but also because they include 42% of the world population and an increasing number of internet users. If we speak about the internet population of those countries, we have around 2 billion individuals connected, so almost around half of the world internet population. Right? So the digital policies they elaborate have a very large impact, not only at the national level, but also on the at the international level. Now, to understand what BRICS is about, I think it's very useful to check what former President Lula was saying about the BRICS. So the logic behind it is to do something different. So it's a club that doesn't want to copy and paste what other clubs like the G7 do, but want to do things differently in order not to be dependent from previous governance mechanisms. And to understand how the BRICS started to deal with cybersecurity and digital policy issues, it's good to have in mind that this is not really, well, while the BRICS is a relatively recent entity and club, the preoccupation of cybersecurity was not an initial preoccupation. And at the very beginning, it was about trade and economic partnerships, but then predominantly entered into the BRICS conversation as a reaction to international events. So since 2013, so almost 10 years ago, the BRICS leaders included the need, the importance for cybersecurity collaboration at the BRICS level as a reaction primarily of what happened in 2013, so there's no revelations. And it's already good to remember that, Mr. Snowden so far, since then, has been living in Russia, in Moscow. And so he has been actively cooperating one of the BRICS countries to share very useful intelligence on how this global surveillance scheme were orchestrated. And on the other hand, it is also useful to remind that one of the main target of this surveillance scheme was one of the president of the BRICS countries. So Dilma Rousseff, former president herself, that then co-sponsored this UN resolution on the privacy in the digital age and adopted the Marco Civil International, the Brazilian framework on civil rights for the internet, precisely as a reaction of this kind, right? Now, since then, since 2014, the BRICS leader had started then to establish a further increased cooperation amongst them in an unusual way. So not with a global treaty or a BRICS treaty on cybersecurity, but creating their own working group on ICT security that continuously exchange good and or bad practices according to how you value them amongst the countries. They created a memorandum of understanding to increase scientific and technological cooperation. And then they created their own institution, the only BRICS institution, the New Development Bank. So a development bank that finances very ambitious infrastructure projects, including digital infrastructure. It's a very different way from the usual type of cooperation, international cooperation that entails treaties and regulatory framework. It's about sharing intelligence and sharing and cooperating on technology and cooperating on investments, which is a very different way of cooperation. And this is, for those of you who are acquainted with internet governance vernacular, a classic example of what we may call enhanced cooperation. So if we take one of the main UN document on intergovernance, the Trees Agenda, that was the result of the World Summit of International Society of 2005, one of the key points that was never very well specified by the UN is this concept of enhanced cooperation. And the BRICS offer a very telling example of how this plays out in practice. A group of countries enhancing their cooperation, their partnerships on specific public policy issues pertaining to ICT and the internet. Now, this, of course, has been increasing over the next years. And to conclude briefly my presentation, just a couple of hints of how this cooperation is going to and how this has been structured over the past year. So increasingly, cybersecurity governance and cooperation has also included data protection and data security since the Xiamen Declaration. And we have seen that all BRICS countries have been renewing or updating or establishing new data protection frameworks for the past 4 years. Again, if you want to check the various dimensions that we have analyzed over the past years, I encourage you to check this book, not only for data protection, but also for other very relevant spheres of cybersecurity. And then this paper I just published last year that increasingly notes this increasing convergence in some key areas. There are some top priorities. There are some top priorities for the BRICS on which they are increasingly adopting very similar policies and approaches due to their sharing of best practices or bad practices also best practices. And these 3 main areas are data regulations, precisely data security is one of the top priorities of all the 5 BRICS countries, content regulation, and increasingly the fake news issue intertwines with general content regulation that has been adopted by several BRICS countries over the past years, and cybercrime regulation. And this is very complex because you have 3 different spheres that overlap: a UN approach where all are engaging, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where China, India, and Russia are members, and the Budapest Convention of the Council of Europe, where South Africa has already signed and Brazil has already decided to sign, right? I will speak about this in a couple of minutes. And also, on top of that complexity, we have new BRICS approaches on this. Now, this picture that looks a little bit like a picture from a Tarantino movie is the BRICS family picture of the Indian Summit of 2021. And this has been a key moment for cybersecurity for the BRICS, because if we check the declaration paragraph 27, well, it is quite long, so I took the liberty of highlighting the part that is most interesting for today's discussion. So in 2021, BRICS countries, for the first time, they crossed the Rubicon. They explicitly state they want to cooperate and to advance practical intra-BRICS cooperation on cybersecurity, also with legal frameworks on cooperation among the BRICS and with intergovernmental agreement on cybersecurity cooperation. This was the first time that the BRICS explicitly mentioned this cooperation through norms, through binding legal frameworks. And this has been reiterated this year. Only some weeks ago, at the end of June, the 14th BRICS Summit took place, always in an online format, but hosted by China. And again, if we take the Beijing Declaration, again, we have this increasing commitment to intensify cooperation on these specific issues, to support, on the one hand, the ongoing UN efforts to create a cybercrime convention, but also to establish BRICS frameworks on this. And this, to conclude, I think over the next couple of years will bring to very interesting discussion on this topic, because there is a very relevant diplomatic gymnastics that will be needed to articulate these 3 converging but also diverging dimensions. As I was mentioning, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that already has a framework on information security, the ongoing UN effort where all BRICS countries are engaging into the development of a cybercrime convention, a convention for on the misuse of ICTs. And then the fact that South Africa and Brazil are adopting also the Budapest Convention, so a framework that is driven by Western countries and hosted by the Council of Europe. So this will lead, I'm sure, to very interesting discussions and debates over the next couple of years. We will analyze them, of course, at the Cyber BRICS project, And if you have any questions on this, I'm very happy to speak and elaborate more about this in the question and answer session.
Thank you, Professor Luca, for that wonderful and super comprehensive intro on cybersecurity across the BRICS and how they are cooperating not only through legal frameworks, but also different projects. The questions, we're gonna open a Q&A session at the end of all presentations, so please write them down and we'll get to them at the end. Next up, we have Ksenia Ermoshina from Russia. Her presentation will be focused on Russian cyber sovereignty in the context of war and how the Runet sovereignty project has been impacted by economic sanctions. So Ksenia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this panel. It's really interesting to look at this BRICS perspective. And today I will be talking mostly about the project of sovereign Runet and how this refers to the vision of cybersecurity as it has been for many years, almost 10 years, vehicles by the Russian government, for whom the cybersecurity of Russian cyberspace is directly connected to control of information flow inside and outside of the country. And it is with this perspective that the project of sovereign internet has been for a long time actually worked upon and has been now put in practice. And I will talk about how this project was actually and is questioned after the 24th of February and the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. So to start, it is important to understand that Russian internet used to be relatively free and decentralized. It was counting around 3,500 internet service providers that were operating in the country. And these providers, most of them, not most of them, but many of them owned their own infrastructure. It means that they had their own landline cables, and many of them had even transnational cross-border cables that were connecting Russia with the outside internet. For example, St. Petersburg were pretty much connected to Finland and to major operators from the Tier 1, Tier 0, the Scandinavian major operators. But after 2011, 2012, we have seen what we now call the turn to sovereignty in the way of governing the Runet and in the attitude of the government towards cybersecurity. This corresponded to the first set of laws that were adopted around 2011, 2012. And those laws that were controlling the narratives and the content published online were actually coincided with the rallies against electoral falsifications. When Russian citizens first went out on the streets, there were many of protests, and the narrative of sovereignty connected the rise of social networks that were mostly American, their revolutionary potential, and the dangerous influence of the so-called Western values on the Russian culture, and that challenged actually Russian cultural and political norms. So looking at the danger of these social networks, the government has created a special body that is called Roskomnadzor, and this body is in charge of monitoring and regulating the Russian cyberspace, for example, by creating blacklists, the lists of URLs that have to be blocked according to a bunch of laws that I will be now talking about. But what's interesting is that it is in 2014 when the war in Ukraine started, and it's here for 8 years already. The war with Ukraine actually played a central role in the escalation of control of Russian government over its networks. Russia occupied Crimea and made it a laboratory of internet sovereignty. So I was studying with my colleagues from RIPE NCC Crimea as a use case of information control and of this materialization of the new vision of cybersecurity that Russia has been developing since 2014. So in Crimea, before the annexation, there have been a lot of ISPs, more than 100. I was counting them manually, and then looking at how those ISPs were connected to the Ukrainian mainland and via Ukraine to Europe, to Western Europe, and to US, and so on. And I saw how in 3 years after the annexation, Crimea was transited or transferred from Ukrainian to Russian rule, not only on the level of content monitoring, but also on the level of material infrastructure, with new other underwater cables that were built to connect Crimea to Russia, and very specific block lists of websites that were established only for Crimea, and those media were blocked specifically in Crimea, for example, Crimean Tatar media. And following this occupation of the East Ukraine and Crimea, the first wave of sanctions against Russia made Russian government look for Russian-made solutions for information control. And that's where it becomes interesting, because after the war in Ukraine started, many tech companies were fell under sanctions. So West didn't collaborate with Russia anymore on many levels, and Russia couldn't purchase American, for example, American equipment, or even Japanese and later Chinese equipment to be used for the means of control. So now two main forms of information control are enforced at internet service providers, and they are meant to ensure cybersecurity in Russia. So first form is blocking of websites via specific middle boxes. And I was, as an STS researcher, passionate about infrastructures. I was looking at how these middle boxes are configured, what software solutions are used, and how this lets ISPs block access to certain websites. And the second type of solutions is traffic interception boxes. Analysis and storage of traffic via the so-called SORM boxes, or lawful interception devices, that let providers store traffic of users and basically sometimes even decrypt the content of messages that are exchanged over Russian networks. And all these solutions have to be now Russian-made. So there has been a market, a very flourishing and vibrant market of equipment with dozens of vendors who propose SORM and filtering devices. But between 2010 and 2018, in Russia, internet service providers still had a lot of possibilities to escape from control. And there were a lot of circumvention technologies, such as VPN, Tor, or proxies, that have been largely adopted and used by the citizens. In 2019, however, the law on sovereign RUNET has passed, and this law was originally invented or designed to protect Russia from the West, from the Western values, from the Western influence. And this imposed ISPs to install specific equipment called deep packet inspection. And unlike previous traffic filtering devices, these DPI boxes are installed and remotely operated by the FSB itself. They can be activated without any actions from providers. And in the same time, cultural sovereignty was enforced by the so-called law on foreign agents that has been recently extended from legal entities to individuals who are found to be acting under foreign influence, even if they are not funded from abroad. However, and here is the core of my presentation and the conclusion, since the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine, the project of sovereign RUNET has been witnessing some has been questioned actually, and has been witnessing some criticism, because it became evident that these devices are not 100% Russian made. It has been discovered recently that many Western vendors have been supplying components for surveillance equipment in Russia, for example, Sandvine or Nokia. And because of the lack of imported parts, there was a problem, and there is now a problem with delivering and maintaining these DPI solutions and SORM boxes. So the sovereign RUNET project suffers now from being cut off from Western markets, and it turns out to be quite hard to implement this project without any Western or Chinese technologies. Therefore, the war in Ukraine has unveiled, paradoxically, Russia's profound dependencies on foreign infrastructures like Amazon Web Servers or Google services, to even semiconductors that are actually not produced in Russia so much. There are some companies that still make them, but not enough to supply the Russian sovereign internet project, which I think is very interesting and ironic. So Russian government is now looking for ways to circumvent the sanctions. For instance, last week, the State Center for Regulation of Radio Frequencies have concluded a deal with a small company called Execution RDC for 58 million rubles to develop a neuronal network called Oculus that will have to automatically identify dangerous content online, text, pictures, videos. And this company has previously never participated in any government procurements and therefore does not fall under US or EU sanctions yet. So sanctions became now an instrument of anti-war protests for Russian digital activists and also a tool to actually protect the Russian internet from total control by the government. So now citizens are requesting US and the EU to include several digital companies in the sanction list. For example, the Intech Lab, it's also a Russian company involved in surveillance and machine learning for facial recognition. But, and to conclude, I wanted to underline that this effect of sanctions on Russian sovereignty and Russian cybersecurity is double-sided. Because on the one hand, indeed, the boycott of Russian market by technological companies is a powerful trigger that can put pressure on Putin to stop the war, and I hope that it can. But on the other side, the exodus of digital companies from Russia puts certain stakeholders at risk, such as journalists or civil society activists and so on. For instance, Patreon is now not functioning in Russia. And it was mainly used actually by Russian NGOs and by Russian anti-war protesters. So this only makes it harder for Russian civil society to continue any independent activities because of such projects have left Russia. And in this context, I think, and I'm sure that a tailored and multi-stakeholder approach to internet sanctions and internet governance should be adopted, with participation of representatives from Russian civil society and the anti-war coalition. So I stop here and I'm happy and looking forward to the discussion in the end of our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. This was such a lesson, especially considering how an ambitious project like the one that of RoNet sovereignty involves not only cultural, but also legal and infrastructural changes that would basically create the need to have everything nationalized and isolated, which is very hard in the context of globalization and internet companies. So moving on, so we can dive deeper into how other countries are tackling issues of cybersecurity. We have Arindra-ji, who's going to present how India negotiates the domestic political economy shaping India's engagement at cybersecurity norm forums and what this means for the BRICS. Arindra-ji, please, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Sophia, and thanks to Luca and Ksenia for excellent interventions. I definitely learned a lot. So just to start, as someone who has been looking at the geopolitics of technology broadly and studying India and other emerging economies, with India, a specific question for me has been, and one that still looking to answer, is why at certain forums on technology, the cybersecurity norms formulation forums of the United Nations First Committee that Luca had referred to in his slides, which the BRICS statements have also referred to, the open-ended working group and the group of governmental experts. While India has, obviously spoken at those forums and referred to those forums both in bilateral agreements and also in larger agreements such as the BRICS, India hasn't really used it to shape a narrative or to make genuine substantive contributions, although there are some exceptions which I will get to. So why is it that at the United Nations First Committee, India has been a participant, but not looked to actively shape narratives or use it for geopolitical posturing like other countries, whether it's the US, say talking about a free and open internet, or Russia and China talking about internet sovereignty? India hasn't done any of that. But at other forums, especially ones that deal with digital trade, India has been very active championing the narrative of data sovereignty. Even though at the WTO, India hasn't participated in the ongoing e-commerce talks, India has made a number of great submissions with South Africa, in fact, on why certain initiatives are potentially illegal and what are the costs of data governance. So why is there this difference in how active India has been? That's been a question that has been on my mind. It's been the centerpiece of my research. And to answer that question, I hope I'm still audible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was seeing a bit of a lag in the video, so that's fine. So I'll divide my presentation into basically 5 parts, which will help me kind of get to this question. So first is I'll quickly cover the domestic legal and policy landscape. Second, look at what are the institutions governing cybersecurity in India. Third is looking at the multi-stakeholder ecosystem, so civil society, industry that shaped the ecosystem. Fourth is look a bit at what the external climate is like, both in terms of threats and opportunities. And fifth, and this will speak a little bit to what Luca was talking about how this impacts the role of BRICS, or how India could impact the BRICS, and consequently, what is the potential for cybersecurity governance through the BRICS prism as a whole. And kind of linked back to the first committee of the United Nations that looks at cybersecurity and disarmament. So on the domestic policy landscape, to give you a very quick bird's eye view, of course, India's legislation on cybersecurity started with the Information Technology Act back in 2002. There were a couple of amendments in 2008 and 2011. But of course, that catered to a very different time when not as many people had access to the internet. There weren't smartphones. People didn't have personal computers. It was largely to support the fairly quickly growing business processing outsourcing industry in India. There were a couple of amendments in 2008 and 2011 that looked at sensitive personal data as people started accessing the internet more, and of course also started addressing questions on intermediary liability and safe harbor and so on. The IT Act is going to be amended very soon to cater to challenges today. So that's something that's in the works. But throughout this, the IT Act provisions look at cybersecurity as largely a micro and individual private sector question rather than a macro national security question. So if you look at the provisions of the Information Technology Act, they actually talk about reasonable security practices. The rules issued under the Act talk about reasonable security practices for corporations. They talk about notifying the computer emergency response team. But obviously the Act doesn't take into account the wide array of threats, both external and internal, that would more broadly come under national security. So it looks at private loss of data, financial fraud, those sort of things come within its ambit. I think from 2009 to 2014 is when India really starts thinking about cybersecurity as a national security priority. This was, of course, because of the fallout of a few different attacks, one called GhostNet. Stuxnet there was some fallout from the Stuxnet attack as well. So that's when India really starts thinking about cybersecurity as a macro national security issue. And in 2013, the national, what was called the National Cybersecurity Policy was issued. That was largely a list of ambitions, things that are to be done, and fairly broad ambitions at that. So there are things like to ensure that there are audits, to ensure there is cyber resilience. So nothing really or not much really concrete in that document, the NCSP in 2013. But there were two major takeaways, which I think is important for anyone looking to understand India's cybersecurity journey. One was the fact that, as I mentioned, that document issued by the central government started recognizing the fact that cybersecurity is a national security issue. Second, it set up the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, which I will get to in just a bit. It's one of the nodal institutions protecting and looking at critical infrastructure or threats to critical infrastructure in India. So this National Cybersecurity Policy did that. And there are other various military documents, the Land Warfare Doctrine, some naval documents as well, that mention cybersecurity, but stop short of articulating a cyber defense doctrine just yet. There was supposed to be a major a national cybersecurity strategy that was going to update the NCSP of 2013. There were robust consultations held from 2020 onward, where a number of stakeholders did participate, but we've not seen a public copy of that document yet. And there are multiple reasons, COVID being one of them, that that document has not been published. But I think that document makes attempts at kind of reconciling the geopolitical domestic landscape and really trying to promote cybersecurity both as a kind of individual capacity as well as a larger national security priority. So that's the first part, just looking at law and policy in India. It's a very bird's eye view. Of course, it's still, simply put, it's a work in progress. I'll now get to the institutional landscape, and there are 4 ministries that broadly talk about or are relevant for cybersecurity. There's, of course, the Prime Minister's office that hosts a number of sub-institutions, including the Office of the National Cybersecurity Coordinator, which is an advisor to the Prime Minister only on cybersecurity issues. It's the present NCSC's Lieutenant General Rajesh Pant. And so that again shows that, and the NCSC is part of the National Security Council, again shows that cybersecurity is being treated as a major national security and national defense issue. Another evidence of that is the Ministry of Defense. They've set up what is called the Defense Cyber Agency that actually brings in officials from all three branches of the armed forces, and again looks to look at what cybersecurity means for the armed forces. Defense Cyber Agency, again, an important institution that was set up quite recently. The NCIIPC that I was mentioning was set up in 2013 under the NCSP, was actually, that comes under the Prime Minister's office as well. So, and the other institution obviously is the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Again, India's Computer Emergency Response Team comes within that, shows that there is a definite connection between what Luca was mentioning earlier. The METI looks broadly at data governance, data protection, but also looks at cybersecurity. So there is a definite connection between that. The Ministry of Home Affairs, like in other countries, looks at cybercrime largely, and kind of internal threats to cybersecurity. And then there's the Ministry of External Affairs that has a cyber diplomacy division, as well as a new division on emerging technologies that handles India's global negotiations. So these 5 ministries broadly looking at cybersecurity, again, really cementing the fact that it's a big national security priority. So, sorry, I wanted to go into the kind of details a bit to then look at, okay, who are the broader stakeholders shaping the ecosystem? So, of course, there is an active civil society. So you have digital rights organizations, think tanks that are shaping the ecosystem. And that's where one of the first tussles on cybersecurity, again, that is playing out across BRICS countries and all countries in the world, really, about this tussle between security and rights. So on content moderation, what is the right level of regulation as per India's constitutional framework on free speech? On surveillance, what reform do we need to ensure that individuals feel secure in cyberspace while still ensuring that the security benefits of surveillance to intelligence agencies are not denied? A debate is ongoing on end-to-end encryption. Then, of course, the debate on the security benefits or the supposed security benefits of internet shutdown. So there is that debate that is happening between civil society and government, and that's a vibrant debate, and that's being charted out as in all countries. There is, of course, industry is playing a critical role. It's obvious why industry is playing a critical role in shaping the cyber landscape. So I spoke to you about the robust consultations that were held under the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and industry players in a consortium of industry players, the Data Security Council of India, the NASSCOM, which is the kind of coalition of tech players in India, they made submissions that focused on supply chains, that focused on protecting critical infrastructure. And that was interesting to see that industry is also getting into the game of cybersecurity, not just as a private sector priority, but as a national security priority. And of course, there is the government, and I mentioned that the government has been taking up cybersecurity itself as a major issue. So now, given these 3 things, that's when I come to the external landscape, which is the 4th part of my presentation, that obviously India is the victim of cyber attacks, a lot of them attributed to come from abroad, as well from potential adversaries. So why has then India not looked at shaping norms at, say, the United Nations First Committee or the open-ended working group, but instead focused on things such as, say, capacity building or cooperation or exchanges between the computer emergency response teams? And I think the answer to that simply is that unlike the kind of countries that have been active at the First Committee, India does not yet see a value in shaping the normative landscape, the normative global landscape on cybersecurity one way or the other. One is, of course, because India's domestic cybersecurity institutional landscape and thinking is evolving. The cyber doctrine is evolving, and really, if you look at Indian law, Indian technology law at large, beyond cybersecurity, it's very difficult to say whether India fits into a sovereignty model or into a kind of the other, I suppose, free flow, unregulated model. Right? There is obviously a desire to regulate players, a desire to regulate the internet, but at the same time, there is also a very clear constitutional understanding of free speech, and that obviously transcends into how India thinks about values when regulating the internet. So I think the reason why India has chosen to focus on a couple of very specific issues. So if you look at India's submissions to the OEWG or Indian statements, they focused on trusted supply chains, they focused on critical infrastructure, relatively one non-controversial because it doesn't put India into one of the two kind of camps between the US and China, Russia. But at the same time, it does cater to some of the industry demands and what are India's key strategic priorities at this time, which is ensuring that there is some protection. So just to conclude my presentation, I want to talk a bit about BRICS, and there was this question of BRICS cooperation and on cybersecurity and also various other issues that are linked to cybersecurity, data protection, cybercrime. I think that one is, if you're talking about shaping norms, and I'd again love to hear what Luca thinks about this, I don't think that we'll have kind of a BRICS normative agenda on cybersecurity, simply because I don't think all the countries are really, at least right now, on the same page as of now. But that doesn't mean that there can't be capacity building exercises, that there can't be exchange of best practices on data protection, what works for differently placed emerging economies outside the EU and that has dominated data protection and cybersecurity discussions so far. So there is that potential. There is obviously potential for symbolically recognizing cybersecurity, which the documents that Luca shared are definitely there. But I am skeptical about both the value of a BRICS normative agenda and also whether it is possible. Rather than that, I think it's very clear that the BRICS countries are very clear about ensuring that strategic interests of each country is what is the most important thing when negotiating globally. And I think that India is an example of that, where it looks at what is the core immediate short-term strategic interest right now. Right now it is securing supply chains and critical infrastructure, and that is how India will look at global forums. And obviously digital trade, it has been more active because the digital trade forums may impose immediately legal obligations, and that's where this difference kind of comes from. I'm still exploring this question. So yeah, thanks a lot for hearing me out, and look forward to the discussion and responses to my hypotheses as well throughout the course of this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arindaji. A lot of questions popping up right now, but I want to hear more, if we have the time, about why you're so skeptical about the BRICS agenda. But let's hear what Professor Sizwe has to say now. He will be talking about a little bit about the South African context. So Professor Sizwe, please. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I just think my presentation is not up just yet, but thank you. I've decided to give a rather an update than a discussion on what is happening in South Africa. So we've basically had, in the last 10 years, a lot of changes when it comes to cybersecurity legislation, when it comes to data protection laws, as well as cybercrime legislation. So the question that one has always asked is that with all these rigid pieces of legislation, where are we as a country in terms of cyber security? So if one were to see, for instance, we had the cybersecurity bill many years ago, and the cybersecurity bill was an offshoot of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. But somewhere in the midst of POPIA being legislated and other pieces of legislation, there seems to have been a backseat concerning the drafting of cybersecurity legislation. So I'm going to give you, on the one hand, should I say, historical update with regards to where we are now in terms of our data protection laws, cybercrime laws, and then obviously, last of not least, our cybersecurity legislation. Now, let me just share. A moment there. See what I'm sharing there at the moment. So the title of the presentation was actually Intersections of PIA, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act and Cybercrimes Act. But as I was conceptualizing the presentation, I noticed that, wait a minute, in the context of the word cybersecurity, the cybersecurity bill has disappeared. So I thought it may be very, very important just to give you a background. So in 2003, we have our POPIA, that is the Protection of Personal Information Act. In 2016, the Information Regulator is inaugurated, and the first Information Regulator Data Protection, should I say, authority is created in 2016. And mostly you can see there the universally accepted data protection principles. Very, very important there with regards to cybersecurity, because I wanted to zone in on that, the whole issue of reporting of data breaches, as well as having the assessment of internal and external risks, maintaining safeguards, proper safeguards, having to ensure that cybersecurity, or should I say confidentiality of data, is always protected. And in the event of a data breach, like I said, breach notification to the data subjects, as well as the information regulator. We then see, last year, we see the Cybercrimes Act. This is now the Cybercrimes Act that is developed over a period now of about 20 years from the ECT Act as we had it. So the ECT Act was an omnibus legislation that dealt with e-commerce, cybercriminality, domain name disputes, everything. So we now have a single source of legislation that deals with cybercriminality. And as you can see there, we have all sorts of sections dealing with all sorts of unlawful access to data, unlawful interference with information systems, internet fraud, cyber forgery. I really don't want to go into a formal lecture considering the time that we have, but what we see missing here in this entire picture is the cyber security framework. So in 2015, we had what we called the National Cybersecurity Policy Framework. And this was there to address acts of terrorism, cybercriminality, and so forth. And we can also see that these particular sections also showed themselves in the 2015 Cybercrimes Bill, but they were later on abandoned in the 2018 Cybercrimes Bill because the word cybersecurity completely disappeared. So where now? Where do we go now in terms of cybersecurity? So we've had an interesting development in 2019, and I've actually noticed that, you know, we always talk about PIA and cybercrime. We completely forget that there's a Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. So that was put into law in 2019 to deal with the protection of critical infrastructure, the determination of what is critical infrastructure, be it on the private sphere or public sphere. And I'm also pleased to say, as I said, this is an update, that I think in February, our police commissioner, Minister of Police, he has now put in the inaugural Critical Infrastructure Council. One of my colleagues, Advocate Korombi, Lufuna Korombi, is one of the members there, and they are now part of this Critical Infrastructure Council that has been set up to assist. So I'm just saying, you also see from the information regulator, we now finally have an enforcement committee. After the first 5 years of the information regulator, the POPIA in the final year becomes law, but there's no enforcement mechanism. So on the 22nd of July, 2022, that's an error there, my mistake, 22 July 2022, that is when the enforcement committee came into force. And with regards to the cybercrimes legislation that I told you about, there's also now a call for comment for what we call standard operating procedures for the collection of evidence. So there, once again, it's the whole privacy security debate. And very recently, on the 15th of August, the information regulator has issued a new form and a guideline on how to report security compromises, data breaches, and has a prescribed form now for people to notify. Where is the cybersecurity bill? Question mark, question mark, question mark. We don't know where that is now, but we have heard whispers that it will be finding its way back on the agenda again. So that is the short brief on what is happening in South Africa. Back over to you, moderator.
Thank you, Professor Sizwe. This was very enlightening. And I think we have some time for a few of the questions that we've received. So I think we can start with one that is about the BRICS overall. And then if anybody wants to have a go at it, just please raise your hand and then we'll direct them. Considering the local initiatives of the BRICS countries in relation to cybersecurity, what would you consider fundamental in terms of possible cooperation? Do I have to call out names? Okay, Luca, please, and thanks.
Yeah, actually, we are, it's interesting because this is actually something we've been working over the past couple of years, and we have a couple of studies actually that are in the pipeline. One book on digital sovereignty in BRICS, and another one on data architectures in the BRICS that develop actually very compatible answers to this question. So in terms of priorities, as I was mentioning before, there are already some priorities that are emerging as very compatible. And as Brigitte was mentioning, there is no common convergence. Also because, again, due to this almost 10-year-old continuous cooperation and exchange of information, the kind of priorities end up being very similar, and also very similar to priorities of other countries. So we have, again, I was stressing data security and data protection, content regulation. These kind of priorities are very much shared with other countries. Cybercrime legislation also is something uppermost in the agenda of other countries. But you see that BRICS are developing shared approaches, and something that actually is becoming increasingly relevant and evident is that even if they all have very strong feelings about digital sovereignty and how to implement it, also that is where the divergence starts, because they are very heterogeneous countries with very heterogeneous political systems and legal systems and thinking. But there are a lot of elements of convergence and also compatibility. We have been developing some papers about legal interoperability in the BRICS, precisely stressing what already is very similar. And I think one of the key elements that we are also stressing in this research that will be published soon is about data transfers. These are also, given the increasing cooperation in terms of businesses, transnational businesses, tech businesses that provide services or digital goods to the 5 countries, be them Chinese, Indian, Brazilian, to a lesser extent Russian or South African, but there is increasing cooperation on this as well. The fact of establishing precise rules and agreed rules, even if not through a treaty, but the same national rules that are very much compatible with regard to data transfer, what is to have national sovereignty on data or on infrastructure, on services. This can be done even in the absence of what they are now calling for, which is an intergovernmental agreement. Even if you do not have this, but you have spontaneous convergence of national framework, this would facilitate a lot and would not require international treaties and would be feasible. And in my view, it's already happening.
Thank you, Professor Luca. Does anybody wish to complement? Arindreji?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think just thanks, Luca, for that excellent point. And I think I agree fully with what Luca said just now in terms of all the ideas, in terms of the interoperability of some legal frameworks. I wanted to just add the fact that when we think of a grouping, there are multiple minilateral groupings emerging in the technology sphere. I think the first thing that often gets thought of is, okay, what is the value or the shared value that this grouping has? And I think that often occludes and sweeps under the carpet different forms of cooperation that are not contingent on necessarily having all shared values. So just to take another example, this the Indo-Pacific economic framework that's come about, or any other coalition. I think the first thing that people speak about is democratic values, and of course that's important. It's important to speak about how there can be some convergence constitutionally, but I think that an excessive focus on a shared normative agenda tends to occlude the kind of very important things that Luca was speaking about, which is not contingent on having like a shared BRICS value approach to cybersecurity. So when I was skeptical about a BRICS agenda, I'm not skeptical about BRICS cooperation, or the fact that there is something or a number of things that states have to offer each other and all of that. But what I am skeptical is about this ambition of a larger normative agenda actually sweeping under the carpet a number of important things that can happen even without this shared normative framework.
Excellent points. Thank you very much. There's another question here that Xenia wishes to answer, which is, considering the crisis in Russia, what is the future of cybersecurity in the country? And how do you see the relationship of the BRICS in this scenario?
Well, it is a very complicated question to answer as a researcher from an independent and objective position. So I will try to be neutral, but it is almost impossible. I mentioned in my presentation about multi-stakeholder approach to sanctions, which I think is one of the aspects that I think is realistic. And by this, I mean that before a company leaves or decides to leave the Russian technological market, IT market, it is important for the company to see, to check if there are important civil society groups or like important media, journalist groups that can benefit from this technology to still operate in the country. And this is a very delicate matter, because I totally support Ukrainian friends and everyone, and Ukraine is actually like the most important thing to consider in this. Therefore, I think that before leaving Russian market, there should be a discussion for every company. For example, Cloudflare did this. They didn't leave Russia because they understood that Cloudflare is protecting many NGO sites in Russia against attacks, and these NGOs try to defend the few liberties that are still there in Russia. So this will be my first point, is to actually talk not to the government, but to the citizens, because having a sane and constructive discussion with the Russian government as it is now, for me, seems impossible. I don't see a way to discuss with governments like Russia now. I cannot imagine how you can even consider what is happening, like it as a government. Like for me, it is not a partner for a dialogue. So if we want to collaborate with Russia or with anything that is left from Russia, I would suggest for the other 4 countries, to 4 partners from the BRICS, to talk actually to Russian society, civil society. And for this, Russian society should build a coalition of representatives from various digital entities. I'm only speaking now about cybersecurity field. I'm not talking about everything because it's very complicated. So in terms of cybersecurity, I see the ISP representatives, the representatives of like software companies, digital security trainers who are still working in Russia with Russian activists and so on. The discussion should be led with these people, with an independent body that can be created and can function to represent a possible democratic Russia that can maybe exist after the war stops. I unfortunately cannot imagine a dialogue with the Russian government now. And I'm very sorry. I really try to be impartial, but it's impossible. Like, it's very, very hard. Yeah, and I apologize. I cannot stay neutral when I talk about these issues, and I hope that you pardon me for that. And I'm sorry that I couldn't provide you a neutral response.
Hi there, Sophia. I think one needs to take maybe a academic approach to that question. To say, let us pretend there is no war in Ukraine right now. Let us look at why BRICS exists and why BRICS Corporation was created in the first place, and what the benefits can be from that. So I really appreciate your bravery in also saying that you are probably not academically unbiased, and I commend you for that. But I think BRICS as such can still be used to share knowledge, to share academic capacity building, be it on aspects of cybersecurity, be it on data protection. I think allegiances and allies, I'm going to call them allegiances and allies, have always been there in our histories. We know from the First World War, the Second World War, I don't have to give any of you a lecture on that. And we know how some treaties are undone and how some treaties continue to exist. So I think one must accept that I think there are some benefits that one can get from the BRICS setup. And I agree with Prof. Luca to say that maybe one doesn't have to go as rigid as, say, let us have treaties, binding treaties that officially make us allies of whoever. I think it's more having areas of convergence where one can share knowledge, can share capacity. So I hope I've answered the question for myself and for our esteemed colleague.
Ksenia, you had raised your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I thank you for this kind of helping me to get down on earth on the academic ground. And I agree that, well, my issue as a researcher in terms of like saving a bit my position here is maybe to look at the materiality, at the infrastructures, and look at alternatives. Because for me, BRICS is interesting in terms of proposing alternative models and alternative governance. And indeed, even within the European Union, and I'm witnessing this as I'm based in France, the debates about US-based companies and US kind of hegemony in the digital world, they are taking place in France. France is criticizing this, as well as Russia is criticizing this, and Brazil and India and all the BRICS partners actually. They agree on that. They need to present kind of a counter power, a balance to this situation. And I know that within Russia, there are still great technologists and researchers and like internet service providers, for example, I talk about them because they own the infrastructure, so it's very interesting. And they propose an alternative decentralized model with thousands of ISPs, as opposed to like 4 that are, for example, in Canada, where I also work and used to live. Maybe in this way, BRICS can give us some ideas and some insights where to go with the governance. So we need to continue this dialogue with the academia from Russia and with the technologists from Russia, and waiting until the moment when we can maybe open up a dialogue with the Russian government again, like reopen it. By now, I would say let's focus on those who keep a neutral position and those who continue constructive work and not destructive work.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Ksenia. I think what you just said about dialogue on governance relates to a question sent by Jason Morris, which is about what primary takeaways do you think are surfacing from the cooperation in cybersecurity among BRICS countries? And what can the West learn about cybersecurity from the BRICS and Alliance? We only have time for this one more question, so if anybody wants to have a go at it and then some closing remarks, please feel free to raise your hands. And yes, Luca, please.
I would like to be very brief, so that if anyone else wants to tweet in, we can have more comments. I think what I was also stressing at the beginning of my presentation is that there are multiple ways of cooperating and enhancing cooperation with our partners. This does not necessarily entails classic international law ways of cooperation like a treaty. It can be done with very interesting results with other ways that developing countries are maybe more used to explore and experiment, like financing joint development projects, technological and scientific cooperation, sharing information. Those kind of initiatives do not require to sign a binding treaty according to which everyone will cast in stone their commitment to specific things. This in Article A, B, C, item 3, 4, and 5, and whatever kind of detail we want to have. They are more flexible, and over the past 10 years have produced already some interesting results. Again, we had, unfortunately, I had no time to run through all the list of details of examples that you may find, but I really invite you to check the research that we have already published on cyberbridge.info and the 2 books that are coming, because it's evident that there is a lot to be learned. I would say not only from Western countries, but mainly from Global South countries, which I think should look more at successful leading Global South economies, as an example, than to Western, very developed countries, which are not necessarily an example of how a developing country can develop itself.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be very quick as well. Maybe take a quick example building on the need to set alternate agendas, and then just end with some remarks on how this alternate agenda, if at all, can be set. So just obviously the United States had a head start in setting the norms of the internet because the internet was born in the United States. So I think the kind of values that originally underpinned the internet, that emerged from one part of the world with the major players largely based in that part, was on the basis of a free, unregulated, unconstrained space growth for companies, largely unregulated growth. Obviously, those norms are changing, but there are still certain kind of anomalies in how these norms actually play into reality. And Luca mentioned data transfers before, and they link with security in several ways. So if a law enforcement authority in India wants to access data that most of which is stored in the United States for the purpose of a criminal investigation, where the victim is in India, the accused is in India, the crime is committed in India, but the data is stored in the United States. sorry, I think I froze again, but hopefully you got most of what I was saying. But the data is stored in the United States. Therefore, you need to go through the cumbersome mutual legal assistance treaty process, and then have this comply with the Electronic Communications Privacy Act and so on to actually get that data. So we're talking about sovereignty, but to access or exercise a sovereign power, you need to access data that's stored in a different part of the world, because most of the companies that process data are from one part of the world. So how do you reconcile this norm of free, uncontrolled internet where everyone has rights and everyone has security with the fact that data is being stored in one country and other countries need to either cooperate with that country or basically adhere to their laws to get that data? And I'm not saying data localization is necessarily the solution, but that is one major reason driving data localization definitely in India. So I think when we talk about an alternate, there is now no more free, uncontrolled internet. It is now digital sovereignty is the way to go. It's actually picking out these anomalies with this kind of perfect narrative of individual rights and freedom and empowerment, and how they actually play out in the real world. I think the BRICS, through the kind of things that Luca mentioned, but also this, I think a very important point that came about is that when we talk about BRICS cooperation, we generally think about state-to-state cooperation. But I think, as Senia mentioned, there is a lot of potential for cooperation among various actors. And if alternative narratives are to emerge, and I'm saying not one narrative, but alternative narratives that challenge the kind of one dominant hegemonic narrative, you can't do it if only the state is involved, right? You need to have different academics that think independently, academics that critique their own state as well as other states. I think that is the only way you can actually challenge, narrative hegemony that one state or a few states had because they had a head start with how the internet was conceptualized. So I think that is the way to go forward when it comes to security and the BRICS. Thanks.
Thank you so much. If anybody wishes to complement, otherwise we'll end the questions here because we've already exceeded 2 minutes from the time. Once again, thank you, everybody. Thanks, David. Thank you, Professor Washington. Thanks, everybody who joined in on this conversation. Please remember to check out the CyberBRICS website if you want more information. There are really good things that have been publishing, upcoming books, and I think that's it.